you need to back up what you're saying with expertise, data, really taking the time to think things out. And that's my job. That's my job as a ghostwriter, is to really make sure that we're buttoned up and to take these thoughts to their natural conclusion, but make sure that they stand up to scrutiny as well. So it's not just kind of passing through, holding it up to a journalistic standard.
What does it really mean to be a thought leader in B2B? That's what we're here to find out. This is the Notorious Thought Leader, a podcast for B2B marketers who want to generate demand by creating content that builds credibility and thought leadership. In each episode, Erin Balsa helps demystify thought leadership and uncovers how companies are using thought leadership to generate demand. Let's get started.
My guest today is Dan Fogarty, thought leadership ghostwriter for VCs, founders, and execs. Thanks for being here, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Erin. I'm so excited.
Me too. I know that your experience is really going to help a lot of the folks that listen who are also, aspiring or practicing ghostwriters. So it's definitely great to be able to speak with you today. So let's just dive right into it. What the fuck is thought leadership?
Oh man, I love this question. And it's phrased exactly right, because it's this. I've listened to your past podcasts. I've loved the answers that people have given. My definition of thought leadership is they're essentially the shower thoughts that you've had about your job or your industry, crystallized and articulated so that they're fully fleshed out, and then backed up with expertise, reliable sources, and data. So if you've worked in any industry or any job on the front lines of anything, whether you're a software engineer or you're a marketer or you're whatever, like, you have expertise and experience and thoughts about that job and about that industry. And they probably like bubble up at these like times that you least suspect, maybe at, the dinner table, or while you're taking a shower, or just you're like on a jog or whatever. Sometimes they're expressed to other people, but a lot of times they kind of stay dormant inside you, and they're there. You haven't quite articulated them yet, but they're there, and you harbor these thoughts. So my job, and I think what actually turns it into thought leadership, is if you take the time, usually I think it works best with another person, but if you take the time to articulate those thoughts and then back it up with actual data, back it up with actual like real world examples or frontline missives, that's what takes it from just being like a take and actually turns it into something actionable. So I think thought leadership falls into a few buckets. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I've been thinking about this. And I think there's a stack of utility thought leadership, which you're really good at. And utility thought leadership is kind of from the tradition of service journalism. When I say service journalism, I mean articles about how to live well, stuff in Wirecutter about what cameras to buy, what kinds of, culture to consume, stuff to do in your town that weekend, what's streaming this fall, how to prepare for getting sick or how to navigate the healthcare industry, the healthcare system. That's all in service to the reader to how to kind of interact with their lives. And so utility thought leadership, which I think LinkedIn is increasingly rewarding instead of like some of the softer stuff that we'll get into, I think it's how to do your job well. That's utility thought leadership. That is you saying as a content director, this was my strategy last year. These are the apps I used. This was my workflow. This is literally what I did every day, laying it so that you're actually helping other people, peers, do their job better, or you're helping people who are maybe outside the scope of what you do better understand that function, maybe in their own company, or adding context to it in kind of a greater macro environment. So that's one bucket. I think another bucket is the data-driven or investigative thought leadership. So that is maybe a survey or report. Again, you're good at that. It's gathering data about a specific industry actually asking questions. That's like firsthand owned data that you have and that you can then share to maybe shed light about attitudes or what's kind of just happening in that industry. It's really powerful stuff. It's why journalism exists. It's to go out there and to get that information and then present it to an audience. I think frontline missives, which publications like Digiday do pretty well, where they're talking to people that work in ad agencies and they're like, what do you think about this? How's AI going to change this? Those are real world, like frontline stuff that's happening right now. And it's what people are thinking about it. And then the last kind of thought leadership, there's other buckets too. There's like thought leadership you can do around events and stuff. But to me, the last big bucket is that forward thinking thought leadership and strategy stuff, which I think Ray Dalio kind of godfather. That's like you pick a topic or an aspect of the macro environment and then ground it in your expertise and some data, aka your authority. You comment on it. You say, okay, well, the environment right now is weird for venture capitalists and founders after SVB. Here's what I think is going to happen. Maybe you work in banking. Maybe you're taking information from somebody that works in banking or talking to them. You're combining different subject matter experts to then have a take. Now that's different than just coming up with a hot take for the sake of having a hot take. I think if you truly believe something contrarian, that's like provocative, that's great. You should have the right to say it as long as you back it up.
A lot of hot takes or opinions.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you get into the zone of constantly having a hot take, you become the hot take woman or the hot take man. And people are like, you're kind of just picking the hot take. You're not, are you really putting authentic thought and intention behind this? So anyway, I think that kind of forward-thinking, strategic thought leadership, like these are my thoughts on the industry for the next 6 months, that's born from real expertise, real muscle memory, real data. And a lot of people have this inside them. There's a lot of imposter syndrome around that. There's like, do I have the right to talk about this? Odds are that you do, but you can also buttress that with research from reputable sources and maybe more subject matter expertise if you need that as well.
So the people that are listening in can't see because you're not watching it on video, but I'm taking furious notes because you said so much and I have a lot of follow-up questions and thoughts to add. So I really like your 3 buckets. So the utility, thought leadership, which at first glance, these titles don't necessarily sound like the thought leadership in the way that I define it, right? So what cameras to buy, how to navigate the healthcare system. And the reason I say, to me, those don't initially sound as thought leadership, because if you do a Google search to answer a question like that, you're going to return a lot of very generic blogs that were written by someone with no actual experience who just kind of read the top search results or, now an AI writing tool. So
100%.
It can be thought leadership. And here's my stance on how you can make it. And you can tell me if this is something that you do too for your clients. So there's one way to kind of make these articles into thought leadership. And one is to add your own proprietary data or add your own first person experience and use it to coin this new term, new discipline, new angle. So for example, a couple years back, I wrote an article for my friends who work over at Metadata, and they wanted a first-person article. They said, write whatever you want. It just has to be based on your actual experience leading content teams. So I shared that I had come up with this framework called the DAB framework, which is kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of playful, but it's actually something that I did come up after years of experience of project managing research reports with a large team and cross-functional team. And I came up with this framework so that you can create reports with like the least stress possible. So that is really a how-to blog. Probably a lot of people who have experience creating reports could have written something similar. It could have been like how to project manage research reports. But I took a completely different stance. And in that way, it could fall into your first bucket.
But there's also like so much more meat to what you're saying than, look, we can go out and we can find so much soft data out there about like, what was social media like in 2020 and what are the trends? And like, you kind of innately know when you see that SEO kind of soft article with questionable sources. Whereas what you're talking about, I would equate that to what Wirecutter does.
Yeah.
When Wirecutter says, these are the products to buy, this is how to navigate your buying experience. Or when the New York Times Magazine is, offering you ways to live better. I'm trying to think of lifestyle brands with real meat to them. That is miles different than what is going to return as a Google search result from just some dude who's spitballing.
Right.
It's like that expertise is so baked in. So even when you're coining new terms, you said it yourself, you have experience, obvious experience and authority to do that. And I think that's the separator. Because again, totally, if I'm like thinking like top 5 cameras to buy, yeah, oh my God, yeah, I think about just kind of these SEO farm articles. But if I'm thinking about something more involved that the editors of Wirecutter who have years of experience trying electronics are bringing to the table, oh, and by the way, they're talking to like photojournalists who use these things every day, that's different. That's a guide on how to live. And that, I think, is the separator, because what we're talking about is a guide to how to do your job better.
Yeah.
What's that utility bucket, right? That's why your content is so good for other people who work in content. It's why you have this podcast.
Right.
It's John Bonini's really good at that,
He is.
right? It's like, this is how I do my job. Take from this what you want. It's helpful. And I think that's an aspect to thought leadership too. What are you bringing to the table? Are you bringing something to the table without, you might have an ulterior motive, but don't make it freaking obvious. Like, deliver something. Are you delivering actual insights or how-tos or first-party data that will help somebody form an opinion or make a decision or know how to do a job?
Totally. You mentioned with Wirecutter, speaking to photojournalists who have been doing this for decades. Yeah, that's the same thing we do in B2B all the time. A lot of time we're trying to write content for senior leaders who have been in the game a real long time, really smart people, not gullible people. So you're not going to win them over with, how to navigate the healthcare system. That's just not the kind of content that we're talking about today. The content we're talking about is the kind of next level up. So most of us kind of start with the more basic content, learning the ins and outs of how to tell a clear story, how to write to a certain audience persona. And then over time, we tend to kind of want to gravitate up to the next level, which is more difficult, but for many of us, more fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Another comment I had when I was looking at your 3 buckets, your second bucket, which is proprietary data. So surveys, reports, or even things like, my expert take on how AI is going to change this industry, because I am the senior leader with tons of experience and insights. So a lot of times, if I'm like helping a company build a new content strategy, I wouldn't recommend to start with bucket 1, even though a lot of people start there because it's easy. Hey, let's churn out some blog posts. That's the easiest thing to do. Sometimes you can actually have better results when you start with bucket 2. You start surveying your audience. You find a co-marketing partner, survey their list, get that data back, put together a report. You don't even have to take the full 3 months to put out a really heavy report. Just get some data back so you can start to do some interesting data storytelling, and you can put that data into your utility thought leadership blogs just to make them much more unique to you and shareable.
100%. I mean, it's what separates an aggregator of news from an actual provider of news. It's the New York Times has reporters. They're gathering data. That could be quotes, that could be insights, that could also be actual genuine data. And that is that kind of raw material. That is that first person information that's not just kind of lazily commented on. That's the actual raw material. So I think it's tremendously powerful to have that. It could be data. It could also be, it gets a little foggier if you're talking about insights. I think data is on a different level, but yeah, no, I think it's tremendously powerful.
I'm glad you mentioned the New York Times. So I'm a huge fan of the New York Times. I read a lot of their stuff, and I think that their journalists are just incredible. Speaking of journalism, It's a nice segue into the next part of the conversation. So I know that you have a journalism background. And, I talk to a lot of different content marketers, and so many of us do have that in common. A lot of us were very fortunate to study either English or journalism in college. And a lot of us were fortunate to have some time working in editorial, whether that was a newspaper, print, digital, or a magazine. So I would love to kind of know, how does your journalism background translate to ghostwriting within marketing? How does it translate to creating the kind of content that helps position companies and people as thought leaders?
It's funny because I think the things that made me insecure as a journalist have turned into things I'm really proud of in my current role. When I started, and for most of my career, I was a generalist. I was an editor at Day Sports and Boston Globe Media. So obviously, when I began, it was sports, but it was kind of a generalist sports approach. It wasn't like I was a beat writer for the NBA and super honed in on one subject matter. I was operating in a variety of sports. And then when I went to Boston Globe Media, lifestyle was kind of my main focus, but we might have something coming in on the breaking news desk, or it could be something very serious. It could be somebody getting hurt, or it could be, again, kind of this like guide to things to do in the city of Boston that weekend. So you're kind of spread out. And what I learned early on was how to research a variety of subjects very quickly, and also the humility that comes with not necessarily being an expert in any one thing. How to ask questions of people who are much smarter than you. And that has served me so much more than having one particular kind of area of expertise. I work with healthcare companies. I work with VCs. I work with founders who create human resource platforms, fintech companies. I mean, and these are things that I'm not coming in innately with a bucket of knowledge on. I understand business. I understand how business is run. That helps me ask questions that are relevant. But I think it's mostly just tuning in and being curious, listening for kind of these threads that you haven't really heard before, but that are really sharply articulated from the subject, and then following that thread and spinning that thread out and helping them maybe see where some parts of it are a little vague, or where they need to kind of support that statement more. And then also listening for what people are excited to talk about, and following those threads, because those are going to probably be the ideas that have passion behind them that are going to be most interesting to other people. I mean, I went on a sports show when I was like 25. I was a sports editor at the time. I went on this like big sports show, a debate style sports show. And I just remember there were times I was on the show for a week, and they'd prepare me, the producers would prepare me with the subjects we were going to talk about, but sometimes those subjects would change on the fly. And I went in, there was one part where like I had to go in and like had 2 seconds to prepare. And it was about like a Russian hockey player I'd never heard of. And I had to like prepare. So that kind of turned me off to TV journalism, because I'm like, if they're putting me on here as an expert, what the heck's happening on like cable news, with like experts they're bringing in? I think this is more entertainment than anything. And it really kind of backed up this conviction I have, which is that you need to back up what you're saying with expertise, data, really taking the time to think things out. And that's my job. That's my job as a ghostwriter, is to really make sure that we're buttoned up and to take these thoughts to their natural conclusion, but make sure that they stand up to scrutiny as well. So it's not just kind of passing through, holding it up to a journalistic standard.
Yeah, I love that. So just to recap for listeners, research a variety of subjects. And when journalists research, it's less about doing a quick Google search and scraping the top SERP results. It's much deeper. Research is maybe not just digital, but I remember when I used to work in journalism, I used to literally go out in my car and go to different sites and sit down with a pen and a paper and interview people. That was how I did my research, in addition to, of course, digital research. So it's really a lot more goes into it than some new writers know about, right? Number 2, how to ask questions. And that really ties in well with your 4th tip, listening for what people are excited about and expanding there. So when you're asking questions, don't fall into the trap that many of us do when we start out, which is we go down our list of questions and we're so inflexible and we're so nervous thinking about the next question that we can't pivot and we can't double click into something that someone seems excited about. That's a skill and that takes time to develop. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it.
And I think listening to interviewers that you like, whether it's on podcasts or TV, pay attention to the thoughtful interviewers, kind of see the kind of empathetic curiosity they have with their subjects and how they're authentically, genuinely interested, and try to pick up on some of they do, maybe borrow some of that energy to bring it in when you're interviewing subjects.
Yeah, and just find your own style, like interview in a way that's natural for you. You know, I know a lot of us, especially women, we're really looking up to Barbara Walters, who's just like the quintessential expert interviewer. But, you know, as amazing as she is, that might not be your natural style. I'm like much more informal and casual. So I do the best I can in a way that's authentic to me, and that's okay. You know, so I would say, yes, I love that idea to learn and find people who are good role models and then kind of tailor it in a way that's comfortable for you. And then the more comfortable you are, the more comfortable the other person is that you're interviewing, right? Because nervous energy transfers. That's something that I have definitely found. And then the last thing, the connect the dots. So you actually use the term listening for the threads. And you mentioned that, you know, you don't necessarily have a niche. Your niche is that you're really good at applying these journalistic skills and connecting the dots. And that's something I've said time and time again that is so, so important. And for me personally, it's why I don't have a super, super defined niche. I tend to stick within about 4, industry verticals because I love how being in those different verticals allow me to take learnings from one to the next. I work on a research report for, an HR tech client. I'm able to take something I learned into the next project with an ed tech client. And I'm able to bring something I learned from those 2 projects. And I hear, that reminds me of this thing I learned working with this client when I'm working with the RevOps client. And then the RevOps client, what I learned there informs like the sales tech client. And it's so fascinating if you really are taking that really curious, analytical mindset to your work. You don't just sit down and think of each client or each company in a vacuum. You're really always trying to connect the dots and find that thread that connects all of your learnings. And I find that that is a skill that can make people really, really successful in this industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
100%.
So if people don't have a journalism background, what would you recommend? Like, how can they go about improving these critical journalism skills?
I always think that doing thought leadership is easier when someone else is in the room or you're doing it about somebody else. I do this for a living. And when I'm sitting down and looking at a blank page and I have to talk about myself, it all of a sudden becomes harder. So I think my first piece of advice is find a peer, whether that's a co-founder or someone that works at your company or a friend in the industry who will sit with you and will kind of take on that role of interviewer, even if it's super informal, even if you're kind of discussing these thoughts with them and bouncing them off, they can help you see where maybe some of the thoughts are vague, or they can help usher you along when you find those exciting threads. I think just talking, so many of my clients are amazing at talking. Mm-hmm. They do it. They talk about their businesses every single day. So it's there. It's just that all of a sudden it becomes a homework assignment to them when they're sitting down and they have to write something themselves. So what I try to do is just take that out of it. I try to turn it into a conversation that then we're going to use to extract that expertise from you and scale it. And I think doing it with somebody else helps take a lot of that pressure off. The person doesn't have to be a trained journalist. They just have to be curious. I would say that again, going back to the asking questions thing, if you've ever had any form of social anxiety, a helpful tool is to take a genuine interest in other people and ask them questions that you actually want to know the answer to. And I think that's what ideally an interviewer does for you. or that you can do with people in your company. So if you're just doing content, maybe the thought leadership isn't coming from you, but you're interviewing subject matter experts at your company. I think taking a genuine interest in them, in your subject matter experts, and asking those questions is going to start to generate the content for you. And then I would say just back up broad claims about an industry with research and reputable sources. So whether that's firsthand information coming from an expert, or it's your own data that you've generated, or data from somewhere like the New York Times or McKinsey or the Harvard Business Review, know how to spot those reputable sources versus some of those softer resources like an SEO article about social media trends from 2020. And you're looking at it and you're like, what, where did you get this piece of data? And where does this come from? Like, know how to spot those reputable sources. You probably know what they are. It's probably a feeling, but just really crystallize that to yourself, that when you are looking at a broad claim, you want to back it up with actual data.
Love it. So this is all really great tactical advice. So thank you. When you're sitting down to work with a brand new client, what is your specific process for, really, as you said, extracting their expertise? How do you go about that?
I like to start with a kickoff where we dive deep into their business objectives. So independent of content, forget that I'm here. Let's just talk about what are the key objectives that are going to move your business forward this year. So that might mean leads. That might mean an investment in a new series of investment. It might mean communicating to your portfolio companies or adding to your portfolio companies, communicating what your thesis is if you're a VC. But what actually is going to drive your business forward? Is it 50 leads for your biz dev team? Is it attracting a Forbes top 50 investor? So then we reverse engineer it from that and we start talking about our audiences. So I like to prioritize those business objectives. And then if there's carryover, if I can actually help with my thought leadership and my content, usually I can, we prioritize them. So maybe number one is number of leads, number two is investment, or those could flip-flop. Well, that is going to help you determine what audiences you're speaking to. So is it investors in the fintech space, or is it, the heads of HR who might adopt this platform that you've built and you want to speak directly to them? You really want to have an idea of specifically, hammer it down to a person, like a specific person if you can, because that makes it easier when it's actually time for us to sit down and talk. You have an idea of who you're speaking to. And then from there, we derive the KPIs. So KPIs might mean we want to attract a Forbes top 50 investor for our next series of investment. Or it might mean we need X number of leads this quarter, or whatever that is. We determine it from your business objectives. So once we have all of that and we kind of just have our foundation, that's when we start the topic brainstorm. Often I'll see I like to work in kind of 3-month increments, but as I'm working with a client and I'm interviewing them about one subject, another subject's going to just pop up in the middle of that interview. And I table it, I save it, and then we kind of are constantly shifting those article ideas kind of as we're moving along. But I generally like to start with a handful of topic ideas to kind of guide us and use as our template. And then it's time to actually schedule the interviews. So maybe it's the managing partner at a VC firm, or it's the founder, or it's 4 executives that each want 2 articles each over the course of a few months. I actually have to schedule the interviews with them. And once we're sitting down, that's where it's ideally in 45 minutes, but sometimes as I'm working with them, I do it less. I pride myself on taking up the least amount of their time as possible. And I sit down and I just start asking them questions like a journalist. Sometimes I prep them with questions. Other people just like working off the cuff. I kind of know how to innately structure these pieces. So I have my own kind of secret sauce about what questions I'm asking. I generally like to start by kind of setting the table, talking about the problem or the environment, really establishing bona fides before I start getting into solutions or ideas or data. And then at the end, I like to tie back to kind of that initial problem statement, just as a cognitive storytelling thing. So people are like, oh, I learned something. Mm-hmm. So that's how I like to structure these pieces. And then I generate the edits, I generate the draft, we edit it until it's perfect. I like to supply people with social media copy for LinkedIn, Twitter. It's their choice, whatever social media they need. But maybe internal emails or client-facing emails. I like to give them the structure of an email to kind of send this out and share it organically. And that's really it. That's how we do it. And then we're kind of checking in. How are we doing on these KPIs? Do we need to shift maybe some of the concentrations that we're focused on? But that doesn't generally happen. We generally get it from the beginning.
Oh my God, I love this so much. We're so similar. And so something that I heard you say when you were talking about your process starts with the business goals, understanding what this executive or company is trying to achieve. And then once you have the business goals identified that content can support, you're going to prioritize them, because anyone who has any, business acumen knows you can't boil the ocean, right? So my old CEO used to have this saying about scope. He would say, scrappy without the S is crappy, right? So it's good to be iterative and flexible and agile and all of those, buzzwords that are important in startup world. But it's also important to know how to implement scope so that you're not spinning your wheels and trying to accomplish too much at once. It's better to kind of have one focus, get those wins, and then build from there. And then the third piece that you said was the KPIs. So before you even do a topic brainstorm, before you even start creating content, you're already going through all of these strategic touch points, which I think is a smart way to do it. And a lot of people think, oh, this person's a ghostwriter. Oh, he just writes. And some ghostwriters do just write. Some ghostwriters take it much further back and they start with the strategic building blocks, which I think is the right way to go. So love this so much. And also it's funny because I also work in 3-month increments. And then sometimes it ends up being 6 months or a year, but they always start at 3 months. I think that's like the perfect amount of time for someone to feel you out and for you to feel them out to see if it's a good fit.
100%. And I think the KPI thing, if you work in content, it's so important because things are changing. People understand the actual bottom line effect of good content. It's not, look, 5 years ago, this was just some soft thing, some nice to have. Oh yeah, sure. I guess we sort of need to do content. I think now people understand that it definitively leads to revenue, definitively leads to investment. It leads to better deal flow. So I think articulating specifically what you're going to do, not just from a content perspective, but how you're going to help their business, you need that. And I think it's important to say, take content out of it for a second. What is actually going to move the needle forward for your company, independent of me, this year or this quarter? And that grounds it in reality. That grounds it with an actual North Star, and it helps the client stay focused and understand what is actually trying to be accomplished. Yeah, we're trying to write nice stuff and make you look good. Great. No, we're actually trying to do this. We're actually trying to help your business. And so we'll know at the end of that 3 or 6 months, did we do it or did we not do it?
Right. I had Sonia Jacob on the show not too long ago. And one thing she said that I love, she's like, content marketing is not a creative activity. It's a business activity. And of course, there's lots of room for creativity, but at its core, it's a business activity. And, the sooner newer and up and coming content marketers can kind of realize that and pivot to processes that enable them to be more strategic, I think the better they'll have a success in growing their career, whether that's as a freelancer or as an in-house content marketer.
100%. My clients aren't hiring me to make pretty macaroni pictures. Yeah. They're hiring me because they want actual results. So you often have to be the one to help them articulate what that is. Articulate for me what is definitive growth and work with them to understand what that means. Sometimes they're articulating it for the first time, but then they really drives home that this is a business function. This is not a soft artistic function. It's not a nice to have. This is actually going to drive you forward.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to ask you, with your background as an editor, I'm sure that you have received a large variety of content, probably ranging on a spectrum of quality. So what are some mistakes you see writers make when they're trying to produce content that speaks to these, experienced audiences, the kind of content that we're talking about, content that builds authority and thought leadership? What kind of mistakes do you see writers make frequently?
The biggest trap you have to be aware of when you're writing thought leadership is that you come off as super overtly salesy. So why is somebody interacting with your content, whether that's a LinkedIn post or a LinkedIn article or something on your blog or whatever, it goes back to that idea of you have to bring something to the table. So you have to show them how to you have to provide information that helps them do their jobs better or understands an industry better or understands some kind of macro tailwinds better that's derived from real expertise. You have to give them something, right? You have to deliver something. But if the entire article is just about how great you are or how great your product or service is, what is the difference between that and more traditional marketing copy or sales copy? People feel duped. They're like, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to read about how great you are. Now, that content serves a purpose. It serves a purpose in sales materials, website copy, whatever. But in terms of thought leadership, you actually have to bring something to the table. So the most common trap is people are overtly salesy in a way that's icky. That's the most clinical term I can come up with. It's icky. I think another pretty common trap is that people think that they have to be contrarian or like all the time or have a hot take to get engagement. And I don't think that's the case. I actually think that's avoiding you being more specific and clear about your actual ideas, because that's where the real work is. It's you actually diving into your assumptions about an industry or opinions about an industry and really testing them and backing that up with expertise and data. And you might find in the course of doing that some of your assumptions are wrong, which is a good thing actually, because it leads to a fuller crystallization about who you are and what you actually stand for. And I think that's work, because you might meet your own boundaries. You might meet your own mistakes in the course of doing that. So I think as an avoidance, people take it to the other extreme and they're like, let me tell you why this doesn't work. And like, that's not authentic. You think that's a shortcut to authenticity, but that's not. It's actually an avoidance of authenticity.
And honestly, it's really easy to get engagement. You just have to say something ridiculous, outlandish, something that would insult about 40 to 50% of people. You'll get engagement. Doesn't mean it's going to drive your business, right? So hot takes and contrarian opinions can be great, but they don't necessarily drive business results in all cases. So I definitely agree with that.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's like, okay, do you want engage? In a baseline level of engagement matters, but actually go into those analytics. What are the job titles of the people that are looking at the content? They have to drive back to those KPIs and audiences. I don't care if 1,000 people look at it if it's not in our buckets of audience. Is it our primary audience? Is it our secondary audience? But more importantly, the primary audience. And again, like, that contrarian thing can be so effective. It can actually be the most effective piece of content that you ever do if it's authentic, if it's what you really think and feel. I call it the Skip Bayless effect. Skip Bayless is this guy that does sports talk. He's on a TV show. The whole thing is him arguing with somebody else. And his whole career has been built on contrarian hot takes. But nobody has that many contrarian hot takes. So eventually you stop believing them, right? You will run out of steam. It eventually becomes some kind of like pathological thing. So you innately know the person's not being honest or human or genuine. So pick your spots. Of course, there's room for a contrarian take, but you really got to believe it and you really got to back it up.
Love it. So I'd love to know, what person or company do you think does an excellent job producing thought leadership?
I would say, again, that Ray Dalio is probably one of the modern god persons of thought leadership. I read his book, Principles, and I might not agree with everything he says, but the way that he comes from a place of expertise, grounds his arguments, talks about pretty far-reaching things about the economy and even kind of geopolitical stuff, but it so clearly comes from places of experience. He backs up what he says. It's done in this digestible, straightforward way. He's a great LinkedIn follow, but that book is probably the densest piece of thought leadership I've ever seen about business and life. And again, you might not agree with everything that he says, but kind of his approach is pretty cool. I like, again, John Bonini's great. You're amazing. I also like this guy named Danny Groner, who's a great follow. I think of him as the Michael Jordan of LinkedIn right now. Danny Groner is somebody that I met years ago. He was doing freelance articles for a website I work with. And he has since moved on to being a PR, working in PR for VCs and startups. I think I'm getting that right. But what Danny does is that he's constantly helping. So he's meeting with people, talking to them if they've just gotten laid off. He'll grab a coffee with them, talk to them, figure out if there's a way that he can help them, give them leads for their business. He writes content on LinkedIn that's really dense and really helpful and not at all an engagement play, but is super, super helpful. So he's been the most radical adopter of this concept of helping first on LinkedIn that I've seen. And it's really interesting and fun to watch.
That's awesome. I've never heard of Danny, so I'll definitely go check him out. We did read Principles in book club at my last company, so I was definitely pushed to be more of a voracious reader than I might be by nature. I do love to read, but I don't always make the time for it. So company book club can be really great. Last question, because we're running up on time. If you were to leave listeners with any bit of advice, be it personal or professional, what would it be?
Take an interest in other people, ask them questions, be present with them, and treat them with respect and humanity.
Love it. That's so nice. I agree. And some of us that might not be like huge extroverts by nature, it can be uncomfortable to go start a conversation or to invite someone to a coffee chat or to make deep eye contact with somebody for an extended period of time. But I'm someone who believes you have to push through that discomfort, and the rewards can really be worth it and be wonderful.
And I think a key to that is putting the focus on them and taking an interest in them.
Yeah.
So much of introversion and anxiety around being social, I felt so much of that in my life. And it generally manifests for me as paying so much attention to myself. Every little thing that's happening with me and like, am I being weird? Was that weird? Whatever. I think a key to kind of kindly moving through that and taking your time to move through that, I think, is taking a genuine interest in other people and asking them questions that you legitimately want to know the answers to, and following up where they're excited and spinning out those threads with them. It's exciting to do that, and you can form genuine human connection with them.
Yes. And, some people I know that I've worked with over the years, they're amazing at having the initiative to keep in touch. I know this one woman who was on my team about, I don't know, 6 years ago. Wonderful woman in her 20s. She's kept in touch with me ever since. She reaches out on a regular cadence just to keep the relationship going, and we even had her over for dinner. And that takes a lot of drive and courage to just keep those relationships going. And she is someone who really is interested in other people too. So she's always wonderful to chat with and catch up with. So thank you, Dan. This has been awesome. I've had such a great time talking with you and getting to know you better, and I'm sure it's been really helpful for the listeners. So thanks again so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for everything you do and for all the information you just freely give to people. I think you typify the things that make a good thought leader. You bring so much to the table and help people be better at their jobs. And that's really the main thing you need.
Thank you. Well, have a great day, and thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Notorious Thought Leader. If you're looking for more stories from marketers who are generating demand from thought leadership, then visit us at motionagency.io/notorious. See you next time.